Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, both in this room and online. My name is Yutong Li. I'm a postdoc fellow of global at the Center of Global Asia. Today, I'm presenting Dr. Rachel Silberstein here. We knew each other back then when I was still working for my PhD at Princeton University, so I'm very happy to have her here tonight again. Dr. Rachel Silberstein is a historian of Chinese dress and textiles. She earned her Dr. Phil in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford in 2015 and is currently Senior Teaching Fellow and co-convener of Arts of Asia module on the SOAS Alpha Wood Postgraduate Diploma in Asian Art. Her first book, A Fashionable Century, Textile Artistry and Commerce in the Late Qing, was published by University of Washington Press in 2020, and this is a study of fashion and textile handicrafts in early modern China. And this book won the Costume Society of America's Miller Davenport Publication Award in 2021 and had an honorable mention from the 2023 Beishantang Monograph Prize. Rachel has published widely on Qing fashion in the journals West 86, Fashion Theory, Costume, and Late Imperial China. So her recent publications include an essay on Ming-Qing fashion in the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Global Fashion and an essay on Chinese foreign textile trade for the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of the China Trade. Let's welcome Rachel, and after her talk, we will have a Q&A session. Those online will also, you can either post your questions in the chat box or raise your hand. We will unmute the mic.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Yutong. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to Professor Sen for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to share my research with the NYU Shanghai community. Okay, so in the in the 1879 edition of the local gazetteer of Quansha, a county in Songjiang Prefecture, the local product section described the range of cotton fabrics produced. There are so many different kinds. They are popularly referred to as the 72 kinds. Now, this line is often reproduced by historians, particularly working on commercialization of the Ming and Qing textile industry, because they suggest extensive quality variations and, in turn, commercialization in the cotton industry. But very little attention has actually been devoted to the variations themselves. So what exactly were the material basis and the technical causes of the 72 kinds of cottons? Now, you might be thinking that the appearance of colored and fashionable cottons would be a question for material culture and art historians. But art and textile historians have largely ignored the development of cotton, mostly, because so little survives compared to silk. And instead, what we find is that questions around cotton textile consumption in the Qing dynasty have been considered primarily by economic historians. And this is in the context of standard of living debates around how the standard of living in Qing dynasty China compared to that of India and Western Europe. So, for example, Ken Pomerantz, in his very influential book, The Great Diversions, makes this claim that Chinese textile consumption stacks up quite well against Europe's in the mid to late 18th century. And he bases this comparison entirely on the quantity of fiber produced. So the quantity of fiber produced and consumed per person in Jiangnan, the wealthiest part of China, to England in the same period. But by basing the comparison upon fiber quantities rather than cloth qualities leaves important issues outstanding. And in particular, it omits the contribution of the finishing sector. So the finishing sector is what happens to a cloth after it has been woven. And in the case of Europe, it's a very important sector in the growth of global textile markets from the 16th century onwards. So it's the finishing sector, which is dyeing, calendaring, pressing, and packing, that helps producers adapt their products to the demands of overseas consumers. This contributes substantial value, so around 20 to 40% of the cloth that is made, and it underpins the expansion of product variety in this period. And recent scholarship has very much emphasized the importance of product variety. So new forms, shapes, colors, and designs, and this is in Europe, often copied or stimulated by global textile products, particularly coming from India and China. And historians have pointed to how product variety helped improve living standards. So this is before Industrial Revolution innovations, right? You don't actually, it's before these innovations come into existence. So this existence of product variety suggests parallels between Jiangnan and pre-industrial revolution or early industrial revolution Britain, but little study has been undertaken into the importance, the expansion of these cotton products. So to what extent was the Qing dynasty, the Qing cotton industry, also adding extra value to its cotton cloths? Well, there have been claims that the finishing sector was key to allowing Jiangnan, the most developed cotton producing region, to maintain its success in long distance trade markets. So especially after other provinces in China developed their own basic weaving industries, Jiangnan could still maintain these markets through the finishing sector. And we have a lot of textual sources that point to the expansion of cotton dyeing in the Qing period. So this is an important text entitled Changes in Dye Colors from a 1631 Songjiang gazetteer, which identifies more than 20 new colors. So it goes through each of the different kind of color groups, and it says, before we had this color, but now we've got these new colors. So we have this picture of change, and I include this painting here of female entertainers just to give you a sense of what some of these colors might have looked like. So the idea that these new shades are emerging and possibly becoming accessible to consumers of cotton is intriguing, both in terms of standard of living debates and also for thinking about commercialization in the cotton sector. So the spread of cotton, we know that the spread of cotton and in China and its displacement or supplementing of earlier fibers like hemp and rami and pueria, the spread of cotton brought cheaper, more comfortable, more durable fabrics to ordinary people. But most people in China would have consumed cotton on a subsistence basis. So they produced basic weaves, woven in the home, produced for themselves in small quantities. So it's been estimated that in the 19th century, something like 600 million bolts of cotton were produced each year in China. And if you assume a population of around 400 million, that would give you enough for minimum consumption of a jacket and a pants set per year. So, obviously, the bare standard. Now, of this 600 million bolts of cotton, half were produced by families for themselves. So this was just households producing cotton that they could wear. But another half, so 300 million bolts, came onto the market each year. And most of this would have circulated in local markets. But Jiangnan, the most renowned cotton producing region, was a little bit different. So its annual production has been estimated at 45 million bolts, the bulk of which would have entered long distance trade networks. And this includes, incidentally, about 1 million bolts of nankeens each year. So this is the term given to the cotton fabrics that were exported to Europe and to America during this period. So this cloth represents a non-elite market that appears to expand. But given how little of this dyed and finished cloth survives, how can we write its material history? As Zhu Chen and Kai Xiangpeng's recent review of Qing consumption history observes, the absence of quantitative consumption data obstructs answers to the question of whether economic growth in the Ming and Qing period led to improved living standards. They conclude that ordinary people's consumption bundles expanded in quality, quantity, and diversity. that claim has not been matched in any way by material culture histories evidencing this expansion for ordinary consumer items. So things like ceramics, books, and especially clothing. So I think it's fair to say that histories of Qing consumption remain undeveloped, especially in regard to urban, market-oriented populations, especially for textile consumption and especially for cotton. So in this paper, I would like to suggest one approach using a mercantile text known as the Bujing, or the Cloth Classic. So the Cloth Classic is an undated manuscript written sometime in the late 18th, early 19th century by a merchant in the cloth trade, likely from the Songjiang region. It's a manual that is filled with advice for people working in the cotton industry, for those responsible for guiding cotton fabrics along its various marketing paths. Now, there are actually three similar versions of the Cloth Classic that have received attention from a number of different scholars. So Li Bin did the earliest short study of this, which importantly dated the version that I use to the 1795 to 1850 period. And I've put the reasons why he dates it in this way up here. They're fairly technical, to do with the spinning technique, to do with the silver ingot term that's being used. But also this is quite interesting. So there's a term used to describe a particular kind, it's listed under indigo, but it probably means Prussian blue. So foreign blue likely refers to Prussian blue, and we'll return to that. And then other scholars have also looked at it for issues about weaving structures, Qiu Pangsheng's very important study of the legal and economic structures through which Suzhou's cotton merchants organized their products. And finally, Jakob Eifert has used the Cloth Classic to argue for the importance of mercantile epistemologies. So basically this idea that the merchant manager's sensory skills controlled and coordinated handicraft production. And we will return to this idea. But none of these studies have addressed what I think is actually one of the most interesting features of the Cloth Classic, and that is the very detailed section on dyeing. So it includes a substantial section, and these include 68 dye recipes. They also, there's another 6 bleaching recipes. And one of the reasons why this is so interesting is that this is more than twice the number of recipes or colors that we have for earlier similar kind of compilations. So the most important is the Tiankong Kai Wu of 1637. So these 68 recipes for different cotton dye colors are particularly interesting for challenging claims, for example, here made by Elena Phipps, that societies with indigenous cotton production, like China, could only dye indigo blue or tannin browns because of the difficulties of dyeing cellulosic cottons, unlike proteinaceous silks and woolens. So because during this period, all dyestuffs, this is pre-synthetic dyes, all dyestuffs are natural. They're coming from plant-based materials. And therefore, if you try to dye another plant material, like cotton or hemp, which is cellulosic, it resists, it doesn't bond well. And you need some kind of substance to bond the dyestuff to the fabric surface, and we'll come on to what they use to do that. Silks and woolens, by comparison, are much easier to dye with these plant stuffs. So here, I want to use the Cloth Classic to examine the question of how the cotton dyers widened the range of colors so dramatically. And I'm going to suggest that there are three primary factors enabling this growth. So firstly, you see the intensified use of certain dyestuffs and mordants. Secondly, you see growing deployment of the set dyeing technique, which I will explain. And lastly, and probably most importantly, you see color specialization within the dye works. I argue that all three factors would have contributed to economic growth and improved living standards for those who could afford the higher cost of a dyed cloth. However, I think in being enabled by dyer and middlemen expertise, rather than cost-cutting innovations or new materials, I think all three factors actually reveal inherent restrictions to the Jiangnan cotton sector's competitiveness. So I want to begin by going back to the Transha text, which we began with, which is where this 72 kinds line is drawn from. And I think one of the most interesting things about this text, the text goes through all these different kinds. There aren't actually 72 kinds, there's 14 kinds, it's being hyperbolic. But still, it goes through, so this is the first section, and it goes through all these different kinds of cloths, which you can read for yourself. And then it concludes, there are so many different kinds that they are popularly referred to as the 72 kinds. All of these come from women's work, because this is a point that's really often underestimated. But all these different kinds of cloth that are listed here are being done by women, and they're being done in the household. So this text is written in 1879, and although it's often used to refer to the entire Qing period, there are some things that are specific to a post-treaty period market. So aniline dyes by this point were present. Foreign machine woven yarn was definitely present. However, much of the cotton sector remained unchanged from earlier in the Qing. So most steps of cotton production were still rural household activities. The vast majority of Jiangnan's estimated 45 million bolts were woven by women and girls in rural households and sold in villages and market towns to brokers and middlemen. And you see these tasks being visualized here. So ginning, bowing, spinning, sizing the warp, warping the loom, weaving, these are all being represented. And this is a woodblock print genre known as the 10 Tasks of Women, which I think are possibly being produced for motivational or valorizing purposes. But images like this and the text highlight gender as a really critical determinant of labor and productivity in the cotton sector. However, the text continues, and it describes 3 more varieties of cotton cloth which are not made by women. So it says that if made by the dyers, then it uses a knife to scrape it. They have an awn like that of the Tibetan pulu cloth, and this is known as scrape flannel cloth. That which uses a great stone to press it is known as calendared cloth. That which uses a pile of paper stuck in layers as if printing a pattern on top and uses lime mortar to print the design on top is called printed pattern cloth, and the original name is medicine spot cloth. These 3 kinds are all made by the dye works to be sent for sale by merchants, and these are not women's work. So these kinds of cloth were produced by professional workshops, and the distinction that the text is really making here is a distinction based on tools. So the text really emphasizes their finishing tools: knife, stone, and block. And these steps did not take place in the household. These steps took place in sometimes reasonably large-scale urban workshops, many located in Suzhou. So we know that finishing workshops for dyeing and calendaring first began during the Ming Dynasty in the Songjiang area. But during the late 16th century, early 17th century, a time when Jiangnan textiles are really expanding, Suzhou starts to gain a reputation for finishing. So whether you were a producer of silk textiles or a producer of cotton textiles, people started sending their products to Suzhou for processing, for dyeing and calendaring. And so we know that the finishing sector grows to considerable scale here. So this is an image by Qiu Ying of the Qingming Shanghe Tu, and he's updated it for late Ming Suzhou. And we see here an image of a calenderer over here calendaring the cloth, and someone is hanging up in front of him the bolts of dyed cloth. It's really difficult to get a sense of what scale is involved here. We have a Wanmi period, so early 17th century memorial, which describes the Suzhou dye works as having more than several thousand dyers, but we don't know what proportion dyed cotton and what proportion dyed silk. So it's very hard to estimate. We know as well that the number of calendars, so not just the dyers, but the calenderers who smoothed and glossed the cotton fabric also grew apace. So we have a 1720 Guild stele, which describes the calendars are of Suzhou number no less than 10,000. Calendaring is a process. I've shown you here how it's done. It's kind of amazing. You use a set of 3 tools: the calendaring stone, which is set onto the wooden roller, which is set onto the cloth, which is set onto a stone base plate, and then the calendarer uses his feet to tread back and forth. And it's a really important step because it's smoothing, it's glossing, and it's also kind of bringing the cloth closer together. It makes it kind of windproof and dustproof, which is really important if you want to export it to the north. So originally, the finishing shops combined dyeing and calendaring, and that's what we're seeing here in Qiu Ying's image, right? This is the calendarers and the dyers are together. But during the early 18th century, they separated. And this kind of gradual specialization and the ways in which social organization, underpinned by growing commercialization, enables this expanding industry is something we will return to. But the key figure here, yes, so you see the dyers and the calendarers separate. The key figure here in orchestrating this commercialization are the Zihao cotton brand stores, which are described in this local gazetteer. So they say Su cotton, Suzhou cotton, or Songjiang cotton is famous throughout the land. Those engaged in this business are based around Changgate on the upper and lower Tang streets, and they are called Zihao. Each production stage has a specialist: bleaching, dyeing, inspection, and sales. Often, several tens of families depend upon a single zihao for their livelihoods, so only those with money can engage in this trade. This is an incredibly important text. However, it really doesn't describe or detail the steps in much detail. And what we're going to focus on here is 2 particular stages, so the dyeing and the inspection. What we know is that one of the most important figures in this industry was the so-called cloth examining friends, the Kanbu Pengyou. So these were the middlemen brokers. They were responsible for going out into market towns and villages to buy the cloth that had been woven by all the women in their households. They inspected the quality, and then they transported it to the workshops to be dyed and calendared. And these cloth examining friends are clearly very important. So in the Cloth Classic, it says, of all those hopeful of running a cotton brand business, only in the dye works can unlimited profit be extracted. And the cause of this lies entirely in examining the cloth. And it's the cloth examining friends' knowledge that is represented in the Cloth Classic. And as we'll see, the expansion of dye colors is predicated upon their knowledge. And this is why the Cloth Classic says the person who inspects the white cloth is the backbone of a zihao. So these businesses depended upon those in charge of quality control, basically. Now, to understand this, we have to look at the Qing dynasty sector, the dye sector. So the dyeing sector was originally, and to some extent continue to be, rooted in local ecosystems. Li Dou, in his records of the pleasure boats of Yangzhou, has this wonderful section listing these different colors that are coming from the Jiangnan dye works. And all of these names for colors are deriving their names either from producer place names or else locally grown dyestuffs. So you have Huaiyan red, Mianyang blue, Chao blue, and Sui blue. However, the Cloth Classic also shows how Jiangnan dyers were being supplied by dyes from further off supply routes. So we're essentially seeing the impacts of expanded trade in the Qing cotton dyeing sector. So the Cloth Classic describes several different kinds of indigos, including Jiangnan, which is the most renowned of the Fujian indigos, as well as Jiangxi, Hubei, Hunan, and Zhenjiang. It also describes foreign indigo and something referred to as foreign blue, as I said, probably Prussian blue. Not certain. However, even beyond indigo, the Cloth Classic suggests a more widespread intensification of certain dyestuffs through expanded trade. So this is a detail from a very famous, very rare early 18th century Suzhou woodblock print, which depicts the commercial heart of Suzhou, just at the point where the finishing sector is really taking off. And the detail shows you a dye materials shop, and the sign says sappan wood, alum, walnut, and cork tree trade. And it's really interesting that the sign singles out these dye stuffs, because all four also appear in a section on key dyestuffs in the Cloth Classic. And this section is called Various Locations for Sourcing Colors. And in this section, it outlines the best locations for sappan wood, for alum, for Chinese cork tree, pagoda bud, and safflower. And each one, it lists the different qualities and the local names. Now, along with Sichuan walnut, these 6 materials were the most commonly used in the Cloth Classic. And I have done an analysis, which you will not be able to see at all, because it's an Excel spreadsheet and everything is tiny. But I'll show you a detail in a second, which hopefully you will be able to see. And this shows, so this is on the left column there, you see all the different recipes. And here you can see a detail that circles these 6 dye stuffs. And you can see, so the bolded numbers are the 26, the 24, the 22, which hopefully you can see. I know it's really tiny. You can see that these dye stuffs are being used in a much higher concentration than any of the other materials. So even though a total of 23 substances is being used, these 6 substances are carrying all the work, right? They're doing most of the work in creating these different colors. So this is showing you the dye stuffs used for 68 colors from the Cloth Classic. So walnut, pagoda bud, sappan wood, Chinese cork tree, and safflower are used in many of these recipes. And this is particularly interesting, I think, for thinking about this idea that you have intensified use of certain dye stuffs. It's really interesting for thinking about to what extent the Qing textile sector is sourcing materials from outside of China, right? So for example, is the Nanyang trade, is the trade with Southeast Asia or other places in the world, is that a source of new dye stuffs? So in fact, most of the dominant dye stuffs that are highlighted in the Cloth Classic come from within China. So the mordant, green alum, comes from Shandong or Henan. Walnut came from Zhejiang, Henan, Shaanxi, Sichuan, and Shandong. Chinese cork tree, which was used to dye yellows, beiges, and browns, came from Sichuan. Sichuan is extremely important for the dye stuff sector. Pagoda bud, which was used to dye yellows, was sourced from Jiangxi. Safflower, a red dye, was sourced from Zhejiang, Henan, Shaanxi, Shandong, and Sichuan. And the Sichuan safflower was particularly renowned. The only exception to this is actually sappan wood. So sappan wood was an important source for red and yellow shades, and that had long been a trade good in the inter-Asia maritime trade. So the Cloth Classic specifies supplies from Zhejiang, but also Luzon in the Philippines and Siam. Moreover, although certainly it is true that I do not want to suggest that the dye stuffs remain static throughout this entire period. We certainly see some materials becoming obsolete and others become more popular. But in general, if you compare the list of dye stuffs and mordants and additives listed in the earlier Tiangong Kai Wu of 1637, so I've listed them here. And then this is the Bujing. So these are all the different substances that we have in total, the English term and then the Chinese term. And this is what they're doing. So these are the top ones are dye stuffs. And then you have kind of additives and you have mordants. I promise I will explain what a mordant is soon. But you can see that the numbers, even though the numbers are changing, so you have 25 in the Tiangong Kaiwu and you have 19 in the Bujing. So, this is one kind of comparison we can make. I should be clear, it's a really limited comparison because the Tiangong Kaiwu is listing recipes for silk and cotton, whereas the Cloth Classic is just doing cotton. And the Tiangong Kaiwu is also listing recipes for, it includes several different kinds of indigo, and the Cloth Classic doesn't include indigo in its recipes for reasons we shall see shortly. But the really interesting thing, I think, is that you don't really see much change in terms of the kinds of substances that are included. So I don't think we can really say that the dye stuff trade is an important factor in expanding the numbers of shades, right? We have this expanded range of colors. I don't think it's the case that the dye stuff trade is the explanation here. And this is certainly not, if you compare it to Europe. So if you look at the dyeing sector in Europe, there's a very dramatic transformation that comes about through global trade. So imported indigo and cochineal either displace or supplement indigenous dyestuffs of woad and madder. You don't see any kind of similar transformation in China. And the Cloth Classic, for example, it doesn't mention cochineal. The East India Company and the other trading companies had been trying by this point for decades to import cochineal. Cochineal is not mentioned at all. And I think this is probably because cochineal was so much more expensive than the indigenous dyestuffs. And so I think one of the most interesting things that we'll see here is that the Cloth Classic evidences expanded product variety, not through this European model we have, which really dominates early modern histories of consumption, where new processes to achieve color variety is motivated by exposure to new products. That's not what's happening here. So if that's not what's happening here, how then does the Cloth Classic achieve its 68 colors? So it's twice as many as that we see in Tiangong Kaiwu. So I argue for three key innovations. So firstly, you have an intensified use of the above dyestuffs, and most especially you have intensified use of mordants. So remember at the beginning, and I said about the natural dyestuffs not bonding with the plant dyestuffs not bonding with the plant fabric. In order to make it bond, you needed a mordant, and mordants in China was alum. So alum mordants were used to fix the dyestuff to the fiber, and this created an insoluble colored compound. So alum is vital for cotton dyeing. I mean, not just in China, but throughout Asia. Alum was used together with sappan wood and pagoda bud to brighten the color, and with tannin dyes to darken it. And what's interesting about the Cloth Classic is it's listing two alums. So it's listing clear or white alum and green alum. So 30 of the recipes, 30 out of 68, use clear or white alum, and 26 use green alum. Moreover, we see 11 of the recipes using both of these alums together. This is something we don't see in the Tiangong Kaiwu at all. So for example, to make lychee color, you would combine 7 gin of gallnut, 20 gin of sappan wood, and you would also use 3 gin of clear alum and 3.5 gin of green alum. And just as an aside, alum is a really fascinating trade good in this period. It has numerous industrial uses, and it's quite a substantial trade good in the country trade. So it's shipped from Canton to Indian port cities near textile centers. And so it's being referred to as a kind of proto-industrial raw material. So that's the first factor that explains this expansion. The second factor is the expansion of the set dyeing technique. So this is a practice of combining different dyes and mordants in varying quantities to create colors of varying tones. This is not a new practice. We see it in Tiangong Kaiwu, but it does seem to have developed particularly in the 18th century. So this is something we see that I've illustrated here with 3 red shades. So many of these new colors are actually created from a single recipe, but the dyers are modulating the quantities to create slightly different shades. So in order to create pale rose, bright pink, and shiny red, all of these recipes are using Sichuan safflower, smoked plum, and charcoal ashes. They're just varying the quantities, and that's how you get the different colors. And as I said, this technique does appear in the earlier work, but not in any way to the same degree. So the cloth classic uses set dyeing to create a whole set of purples, a whole set of greens, all by varying these quantities. So the cotton dyer's expansion of this set dyeing technique effectively doubles the number of varieties. It's a huge factor in allowing for these different colors to be created. But the third and final, and arguably the most important factor, is the increased specialization of the dye works. So both Chuoying and this other image, which I have forgotten to add the label on, but this is from the Qianlong Nanshun tool. So the images of the southern is a detail from the 6th scroll of Qianlong's southern inspection scroll. And you see here a dye works here. And you can see all these different colors, right? So it suggests that a single dye shop can create all these different colors. But this is probably not very accurate. Because we have several sources that speak to specialization. So most notably, Chu Hua, who writes this manual on cotton in the early 19th century, describes how among dyers there are blue works, which dye sky blue, deep blue, and moonlight blue. There are red dye works, which dye deep red and pink. There are bleaching workshops, which turn coarse yellow into white. And then there are miscellaneous color dye works, which produce yellow, green, black, purple, old copper, gray, scarlet camel, toad green, and Buddha face gold. So you have this kind of specialization. And this is actually something that we see here. So this is a Nianhua, a woodblock print of the gods Mei and Ge. And this was the dye works guild gods. So these were the gods that they worshipped and they made offerings to ensure success in their dyeing, which was, after all, could be quite unpredictable. And you can see here in this insert that there's specialization, right? So they're using the safflower to dye the red shades. So we know that dye works specialized in particular colors. It was not the case that a single dye work produced all the colors. So we can ignore this image. This is not an accurate image. And this specialization is important. So I've been talking about these recipes, right? And the fact that you have 68 dye recipes in the cloth classic. And this is a conventional term. Textile historians talk about recipes. But actually, I think recipe is something of a misnomer. It's less of a recipe and more of a shopping list. So there are no instructions. And most critically, the order, so the sequencing, is not provided. You couldn't actually use these kinds of instructions to dye anything, really, with success. All it does is list the quantities of materials required. So for example, bright green was made by combining moon white fabric with 25 jin of pagoda bud, 3 jin of walnut, 3 jin of white alum, and Guangdong ashlie. So this recipe, along with 17 others, so nearly a quarter of the recipes, actually calls for the use of pre-dyed cloth. So that moon white fabric over there is an existing dyed cloth. It's been dyed with indigo. It's referred to in the text as jiaodi. So you dye the cloth on the foot of this dyed fabric. So the fabric comes into the dye shops already dyed with indigo. And these are the pre-dyed cloths that are listed: moon white, treasure blue, true blue, kingfisher blue, double blue, and fish belly white. The recipes for these colors are not provided in the cloth classic, and there will be no need to do so because these are all indigo dyed cottons. They are varying in the shade, in their intensity of indigo blue. And this development, so using indigo dyed cloth to dye other colors, is one of the key features distinguishing the cloth classic from earlier texts. Indigo is unique among dyestuffs in cotton in being a substantive color. You don't need mordants to dye indigo. Indigo is able to permanently fix upon the cloth without the mordant, and instead relies on multiple immersions in the dye vat to build up layers of colors. And the indigo workshops would have dominated the Qing dynasty dye sector. It produced the blue dyed cloth that clothed so many Qing during this period. And some of this indigo cloth, so the paler indigo cloth, would have been taken to the dye shops for further processing in order to turn into shades of green and purple. This reliance on indigo-dyed cloth explains why the Cloth Classic devotes so much attention to differences between different indigos. It also explains the cloth examining friend's skills in examining these shades of pale, green, and blue dyed cloth. So it's got numerous texts which describe how to examine these shades. So there are sections like methods for examining blue cloth, secret words on examining green, blue, and moon white cloth. One section describes how the dyed cloth, the colors of each cotton brand is not the same. Each are distinctive, whether called sun and moon, moon white, moon blue, so on and so forth. All these colors are different. And so the person examining the cloth must have their own appropriate method for examining each color. And I think texts like these really confirm Jakob Eyfurth's attention to these mercantile epistemologies, because that was the most important thing. You have these middlemen who are solely responsible for gathering up these cloth, which have been woven in individual households. And these middlemen are the ones responsible for standardizing effectively, for knowing where to send it and what to do with it and where you can sell it. And this is why I think the Cloth Classic devotes so much attention to these, to really managing bias, right? To how to manage sensory bias in your evaluations, how you can establish an objective basis for quality judgments. It has a wonderful line which says that, as for those who pronounce on cloth colors on the basis of just a few samples, is it any different from peeping at a leopard through a bamboo tube or looking at the sky from the bottom of a well? Which I think is a relevant line for us all. So in this pre-industrial age in which large trading networks are conducted on the basis of amassing hundreds and thousands of bolts of cloth produced in dispersed locations by disparate weavers, this discourse speaks to the importance of the cloth examining friend in standardizing the inherently individual. So in conclusion, the Cloth Classic evidences the expansion of clothing colors that began in the early Qing. It provides an important example of what improved living standards of the Qing period look like for non-elite consumers. And it demonstrates that three main factors enabled the greater number of cotton colors. So you have intensified use of key dye stuffs and mordants, you have the use of set dyeing, and you have specialization that allows for the supply of this pre-dyed fabrics. All three represent dyeing innovations that potentially produced economic growth and improved living standards if you could afford their higher cost. But equally, I think all three comes from within the production system. They're effectively being achieved by people doing more with what they already have, rather than being stimulated by new products or techniques. And so I think they're comparable here to the intensified use of agricultural techniques, which increased yield, allowing per capita consumption to be maintained, even though population is increasing. However, I think this account of developing dye techniques in the Qing cotton sector is instructive in three main respects. And in my closing discussion, I want to point to three kind of follow-up directions. So firstly, as I said, I think this presents an alternative model of expanded product variety to the European model. So the European model, which dominates consumption history, we see new products that are created through this encounter with global trade. So it's stimulated by new manufacturing techniques, new materials, or new markets. Instead of technological innovation or centralized production, what we see in the Cloth Classic is you can have value addition, you can have manufacturing growth, but it's achieved largely on embodied expertise. And here we need to think about the embodied expertise of both the dyer and also the middleman, the cloth-watching friend responsible for moving the cloth from household to workshop to market. However, as Paola Bertucci has argued, an individual artisan's embodied skill was worthless without the legal and socio-technical systems that validated it. So she calls these systems, these socioeconomic systems, she terms the social fabric. And these systems were just as important to embodied expertise, I think, here. It's these systems of organization that really enable the Jiangnan cotton sector to find ways to satisfy consumer demand for better, more colorful cloth. I think this case study really highlights the importance of organizational change and specialization in the development of the Qing textile sector. So the separation of the dyers and the calenderers, the division of dye works into certain colors, all of these developments are coming about through commercial complexification. So you see growing numbers of people in the industry, and they specialize and they separate, and that's what enables these new colors. Secondly, this model of creating product variety suggests future research avenues for resolving a conundrum here, right? Because if, as we see, China's cotton textile consumption is complexifying and growing and expanding during the Qing period, how then can we explain its backward position relative to global producers in the early 19th century? Because theoretically, value-added improvements would have allowed those producers who focused on these areas to earn greater profits compared to the basic cloth. But this would suggest expanding market demand. And in fact, that's not very well evidenced. In fact, we see Songjiang, the main, and Jiangnan, the main cotton producing area, actually contracting. It appears to undergo decline from the mid-Qing. So well before you see industrially produced cottons coming in from Manchester, from the north of England and from North America. Well before that time, we see decline in the Jiangnan cotton sector. And we know that much of this is probably due to shifts within the Chinese market, within the domestic market. So Jiangnan is losing some of its market share for standard cloths because other provinces are producing their own. And to some degree, Jiangnan could move up the ladder to higher value cloths. But actually, there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that these markets for higher value cloths were limited and may well have become harder to reach by the late 18th, early 19th century, when real buying power is falling and opportunities are lessening. And we could think about how, and clearly much more work needs to be done on this, we could think about how Jiangnan's cotton finishing sector is being circumscribed not just by the market here, but also by the lack of technical innovation, because its producers couldn't necessarily compete on any other grounds apart from the very beautiful bright colors. And here I think we really need so much more work on forms of craft knowledge in Qing Dynasty China, right? How far does the kind of craft knowledge that we see in the cloth classic suggest the kind of the social limits of artisanal literacy, the ways in which the knowledge of someone like a dyer or the cloth examining friend had limited reach, limited opportunity to speak to other groups, most notably scholars. Nonetheless, and finally, I think the cloth classic really highlights the importance of material culture scholarship in reconstructing developments in craft technologies and their impact on the living standards of ordinary people. Their material lives are often overlooked in Chinese material culture history, which remains particularly enthralled to art historical paradigms of elite and imperial consumption. But the cloth classic reminds us that material culture can be studied even in the absence of the historical object, and it calls for more attention to the many Qing dynasty mercantile texts which offer informative, materially attuned insights into little-known developments in consumption history. The new systems of coloring cotton cloth that emerged in the mid-Qing depended on the development of this discourse, this commercial discourse, but I think our ability to reconstruct a material culture regime whose objects largely did not survive also depends on looking to this discourse. Thank you very much. Oh, I forgot my thank you slide.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for this very fascinating and richly researched talk. So now I want to open the floor to anyone here or online. If you have any questions for Rachel, please raise your hand or type your questions or just raise your hand in Zoom as well.
I can stand, I can stand.
Hi, thank you so much. Really interesting in what you were talking about with like the changes in alum or like the uptick in alum and mordanting. And I'm wondering with these more like high value cottons, how much they're actually being tied back to the workshops that are producing them, because I'm thinking about ideas of like color fast. And so I've purchased cotton, and now what is the consumer expectation for color fast in the era before aniline dyes? And does that impact what houses I'm buying from over the years?
Well, alum, I mean, alum has I don't, there's not very good work done on the history of alum to my knowledge, but alum is always important in cotton dyeing. So I think from the beginning, when you start to get colored cotton cloth, you are depending on alum, and you see this expansion over the period. I think to understand this question, which is a really interesting one, to think about, the consumer's expectation of quality here. So if I buy a moonlight blue cotton cloth and the color runs or whatever, do I take it back to the shop? And I think here we come back to the Zihao, the cotton brands. So branding in the cotton industry is really interesting. In the case of silk fabrics, we have many examples of branded material. So branded packaging, branded advertisements. We have bolts, surviving bolts with the ends with the producer's name woven in. They have images, they have slogans. Branding is really quite something for silk. We do not have anything like that for cotton. To my knowledge, there's no example, even though it says that cotton fabrics were branded, as in the producer's name was woven in or stamped onto the bolt. To my knowledge, none of these bolts survived. So we don't really know what that looked like, whereas we know what that looked like for silk fabrics. And I think what's most interesting is the evidence we do have, which comes mostly in the form of gild steelies. So there's gild steelies, basically legalistic texts, which is trying to control forgery of a brand. It suggests that the branding is basically just the producer name. So it will be Li Hongwu's cotton brand business. And there's nothing more. But that would have been your quality control, right? And this is mostly concerned, I think, with interprovincial marketing. So if you're buying cotton, if you're coming into Suzhou and you're buying up, I don't know, 1,000 bolts of cotton and you're taking it elsewhere and you want to be sure that it's a good quality, then that's the brand name that you're depending upon. And so if that brand name has established a reputation for good quality, then that brand name theoretically can expand its market. I think in practice, what you would have seen is an awful lot of small producers of these cotton brand businesses, each maintaining a small section of the market, but many, 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 rather than certain figures dominating, if you see what I mean. Thank you.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I was amazed by the variety of materials you summoned. I have a question and a comment. The question is, do we have any documentation telling us the experience process of those dyers, or maybe we can call them color scientists, to create the recipes for dyeing different colors? I'm wondering whether we can consider it as a kind of a prototype of scientific research, experimentation, and solidification at one point. And my comment goes to the second point in your conclusion slide, which I think is very intriguing, like how come this advanced specialized craft will at the same time coexist with the kind of backward textile or production in Qing Dynasty. It came to me like when I was reading some modern Chinese literature pieces, and when they talked about the differences between the indigenous cloths with foreign cloths. And I think one key difference is the texture of it. So it's not the color, maybe, the indigenous ones turn tend to be more tough and harsh than the foreign imported one. I'm wondering whether this has anything to do with the machine production, the procedure, but it's just a guess here. So I'll leave the comment here.
Thank you so much. It's a great question. I mean, it's a couple of questions. So firstly, the easier question. So, the text I began with, the 1879 text, by that point, you have a lot of industrially produced foreign machine woven yarn coming in. Yarn is definitely being used, foreign imported yarn. Foreign cloth is, famously finds the Chinese market much, much harder. It's really not until 2 or 3 decades later that it's going to become successful. And you have all kinds of accounts by foreigners who try and, ponder this mystery to them, how it is that cotton cloth is produced by women in the household using these techniques, which haven't changed that much in some areas. How is it that this cloth can be more successful than this new industrially woven cloth? And it seems to always come back to either durability or market understanding. So the Chinese, the hand-woven cloth was seen as being more durable than the machine-woven cloth. So maybe that's the idea of roughness or something, but it's really about durability. So that's one issue. The other one of these dye scientists, and whether we can call them dye scientists, I'm not sure I'm ready to answer that question yet. I mean, particularly because one of the things that we see in the cloth classic is the knowledge that's represented is not the dyer. It's the cloth examining friend. It's the merchant. It's the person who needs to examine and understand the cloth. And the dyer's knowledge is not being written down. You don't have literati going into the dye workshop and asking the dyer questions about how he's doing that. So it's much harder for us to speak to how the dyer understands it, right? Does the dyer, I think this comes back to how we define the scientist. Clearly they're experimenting and clearly they're reproducing techniques and seeing what happens, but is there any kind of further understanding, more theoretical understanding? That's much harder to say. And so I think we need much more work on dialogue between the dyer and the merchant, or between the dyer and the literati. We have examples of cases where artists, like literati artists, worked with handicraft workers. How does that affect understanding of knowledge? But I think at this stage, it's this kind of knowledge, the merchant's knowledge, that there's real opportunity to do more work in, rather than dyer, sadly. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I was also thinking about the variety, but in a different sense, the surprising variety of all these different colors and different shades of the colors. And you pointed out that all of these colors and even the ingredients that go in to create these colors were in the cloth classic is really for the merchants. And that got me curious how much of that knowledge reached the consumers, the people who were buying these cloth. And I'm wondering if there are any sources that kind of tell us whether or not these, beautiful names of a variety of colors were in circulation outside the cloth classic. And I'm also very curious whether these merchants also understood themselves as a kind of assuming educational role, kind of telling the consumers, this is the new shade, this is going to be fashionable, etc.
Definitely. I think consumers were very savvy. I think they had to be very savvy because there were so many different producers and there were so many fakes and there were so many attempts to fool the consumer. You had to be a savvy consumer. We can get at this through 2 main sources, I think. So one is household encyclopedias. So there are recipes for dyeing things in household encyclopedias, and it's quite clear that women would have known how to dye, known how to use many of these dye stuffs in a limited way. I don't think you wouldn't want to do indigo dyeing at home. Indigo is very, very smelly, and it's going to turn everything blue. But other dye stuffs you could definitely dye at home. So household consumers would have had basic understanding of some of these basic colors. But we also see these colors being used in novel descriptions of the period. So someone will be described as wearing a chow blue jacket, for example. So that's another way in which we can get at the kind of knowledge of the consumer. The question of how far merchants pushed certain colors is really hard to get at. I mean, I kind of think the Cloth Classic speaks for itself. Like, to get 68 shades, they're expanding, but they're varying the quantities to get new shades for a reason, but to evidence that is hard. So yeah, I will work on that.
Thank you for this great talk. So I have a question about the professionalization process within the industry. So from your talk, I was thinking it looks like that. So this expansion was a result of the creativity or expertise of the dye workers. But I was wondering, were there any other factors within the industry? So for example, you mentioned there are other specialists like bleachers and also the middleman, right? But I was wondering, were there any other, or did you see similar patterns of professionalization in other sectors within the cloth industry that might lead to the this creativity or development of the dye workers? Or do you think the dye worker section is the most important section, and because of its development that led to maybe the professionalization or expansion of other sectors in the industry?
Thank you. Yeah, I think specialization and professionalization is something we see throughout the textile sector. I haven't looked, a great source here are guild records, so guild steelies, and I haven't looked so much at the dye work guilds and how they kind of conceptualize themselves. But in my book on fashion in 19th century China, I look at the guild records for another group in the textile sector, so the tailors. And that's an example where you see clear professionalization and specialization and clear attempts on the part of a group of handicraft workers to kind of improve their social standing and to claim a longer history and to claim expertise and really kind of to bolster their position in society. And I think that this complexification and this social organization that I talked about, that became really important, that bleachers have their own distinct area of work, and they group together and they try to get more power by grouping together and by professionalizing, essentially. Apprentice records, that you could also get at through guild steelies would be another really interesting source here. And there's lots of records for the late 19th century there. So I think that the apprenticeship and the apprenticeship process and how certain sectors of handicraft workers attempted to control who entered their groups, it's another area that we really need more work on. It's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I work on intellectual history, where antiquity is normally celebrated. So I was really struck by this discussion of Chu and Jin, so in the past and now. Could you say a little bit more about kind of the celebration of newness?
Well, newness, of course, is tied to the idea of fashion and the idea that a society of a given period should have new clothes and new colors to mark that period. And fashion is something I write about a lot in my book on 19th century China, and I'm arguing that fashion becomes very important during this period because of textile commercialization, right? So the growth of newness as a discourse in clothing is a response to commercialization. Essentially, it's coming from the merchants, right? The merchants are ultimately pushing this. That Songjiang text that I quoted, the 1631 one, that's really unique in being so attentive to newness. And we could think here about this late Ming, early Qing moment where you just have so much silver fueling the economy, and you have so many merchants producing things and so many consumers able to produce it, able to consume things. So I think that's what really explains that specific structure of that's what they had before and this is what we have now. But in general, I mean, I'm working on a book project at the moment about wool in China. So most of the time I actually don't think about cotton, I think about wool. And that book looks at the East India Company trying to sell wool, British wool, woolen fabrics to China between 1600 and 1834, which has always been something that, you know, historians have tended to laugh at, right? The idea that the Europeans thought that they could sell wool to China, and I argue that actually China has a very long history of wool, and when European woolens arrived, Chinese consumers would have recognized certain aspects of it. But I have some really nice texts which talk about how Europe, so the English and the Dutch, produce these kinds of woolen fabrics. And this particular text is talking about how it's coming from Japan, so it's earlier in the Qing when it probably would have been an indirect trade. And it says, this is something that previous generations did not have, but now we have these fabrics. So you can certainly find evidence of it. It's kind of hard to find, but you can find it. Yeah, so newness is important.
Thank you, Rachel. I've heard your wool talk, which is equally fascinating. But I wanted to talk about the merchants. Who are these merchants? And the background to this period is, of course, opium trade, and some of the opium traders in Guangdong, Guangzhou are also importing cotton. So these, how does the network work within China? Are these traders connected to the coastal regions in some ways, or are they hinterland traders who do not know what's happening in the coastal region? So how globally connected are these traders? And one thing about this text itself, you know, if it's a merchant related text, there would be amounts, prices, calculations of certain things. Do you see, in addition to the technique, costing of things that show up that, okay, this is what makes us profit from this color of dye or this color of textile? So is there some kind of a, if you are talking about commercialization, is about costing and profit, does it show up if it's meant for merchants, by merchants? And the second question is about gender, right? When you have shown a number of images about women, and I think one of the images had a woman with bounded foot. I don't know if you noticed that or not.
We're going to have to go back so we can check.
Yeah, I think the one with, yeah, I think that one, the one,
Yes.
no, yeah, this one. So you can see some of them have a small feet.
Yeah.
So is this also an ethnic aspect where the Han rather than the Manchus are engaged in the family use of textile? So it's a Han elite that are engaged rather than the Manchus.
Well, I don't think it's the elite. And I don't know if I can give you an answer to the question of whether it's Han women or Manchu women. I mean, my impression is that for the 90% of Chinese, you know, women wove and women were involved in producing cloth for household consumption. So it's entirely likely that Han women with bound feet would have been involved in doing these tasks. It's also highly likely that, you know, you have some attempt to not glamorize, but, you know, it was important that the woman was attractive in this image of the 10 tasks of women. So I think that's also a factor to consider. In regard to the question of how integrated these markets really are and what kind of knowledge, you know, the merchant knowledge is here, I feel like there's at least two questions there, Tangent. But let's do integrated markets first. I think one of the most interesting things that really doesn't get enough attention is China is exporting some cotton fabrics, right? If we're talking about woven fabrics, it is exporting each year about 1 million bolts, you know, approximately to Europe and later on to Northern America. Northern America actually becomes a very large consumer. Those cotton fabrics, which are called nankeens, are undyed, they're not printed, they're not customized in any way for these markets. You do get in some examples of indigo, but, you know, it's basically, it's an unwoven, fairly basic cloth. I think that's a really interesting question. You know, if you had proper integration between the Canton Hong merchants and the Jiangnan merchants, then you would surely have the opportunity for the Hong merchants to say, here are these English, they would like some blue striped cloth, for example. And we don't get that. And there has been a suggestion that suggests a lack of integration, right? So the Hong merchants can maybe send out representatives or can pay deposits on orders, but you don't really see a true kind of entwining of businesses that would enable that kind of customization for global markets. And I think one of the things this points to is just how hard it was for a producer in a far-off place to produce a more visually complex product, consumer product for markets. And I don't think that point is explored enough, right? The difficulties of producing for far-off markets. So that's one thing to say, but clearly we need more work on that. The other thing to say is in terms of, you know, what kind of knowledge? Yes, I think this is very much by merchants for merchants. I think the fact that we see in these dye recipes a list of ingredients, this is because they want to be sure that the dye shop is not trying to fool them, is not trying to scam them. So they need to know how much gulnach you use in this particular recipe, because the way that the contracts would have worked is that that they would have needed to know that, right? And that we know a little bit about how that worked, and they would have needed to be able to check whether dye works, that they're not kind of trying to fool them. There is one example of a cloth that is costed out. So it says, and in a longer paper, I've translated that. And it basically provides costings for the dye stuff, for the laborer, and for the water. And that's really interesting, I think, pointing to the important, you know, water as an energy source. But there's only one cloth color that gets that dyeing. There is also a section that is that costs individual dye stuffs in the market, which is really hard to read. There's lots of quite local notation, but it's interesting data.
Right. Like any last minute burning question? We have 1 more minute.
Thank you, Rachel, for your speech. Actually, I have a small questions about the terminology. It confused me a lot because I play a role for the last 2 years as the outline designer of the Shanghai Industrial Museum. Now this museum is establishing, and it may be opened. It will open 3 years later. So I see you use the cotton industrial. But actually, for Chinese scholars, or maybe even some people from the industrial area, they think these are something with craftsman or craftsmanship like this. But you use the with industrial. Actually, I'm a Paleolithic archaeologist. we use the stone tooth industrial also.
Yes.
But if you are the curator of the Shanghai Industrial Museum,
yes.
So do you think for the period before 1940s, that the contents, for example, like your research, do you think this should be join the Shanghai Industrial Museum? That's my question. Thank you.
Yes, it's the short answer. The long answer is yes. I'm aware that industry can have that connotation of a post-machine age, right? That when you have mechanization, only then do you have industry. But really, I think in the case of China, we could look back to bronzes and the kind of complex social organization and specialization that must have been in place to have the existence of these bronzes. And we could talk about the bronze industry. So I suppose the way I use this is a little bit like sector, like this is the sector, this is the section of the economy that is devoted to cotton production. And I think in the case of cotton, you do see reasonably large scale workshops. I mean, these dyeing and calendaring workshops, I think a medium to large scale would have had about 20 employees. It would have required a fair amount of investment to buy calendaring stones and dye stuffs and so on. So there's a limit to how far they can grow. But but you see medium size, certainly. So I think we have enough kind of size and scale and social complexity that we would want to call it industry. The idea of a Shanghai Industrial Museum, though, is fascinating. I spent the summer working on the Chinese textile and dress collection of the National Museum Scotland in Edinburgh. And today that's called National Museum Scotland. But it started life as the Industrial Museum. And the Industrial Museum has this unique, I think, a unique place in European museum history. And I wonder if there was ever an earlier industrial museum, you know, the idea that you would have a museum that was necessary to exhibit and display objects from, say, the textile industry. And in Scotland, the reason why that's established, so it's established in 1854, is because of the Industrial Revolution. It's because of growing, you know, machine-produced textiles, printed textiles that Scotland is trying to produce to sell to the rest of the world. And so they collect objects that illustrate industrial processes. So it's really interesting that now Shanghai is creating an industrial museum, and I'd love to hear more about that. Thank you.
We have a lot of burning discussions. Unfortunately, the time is up here, but I want to thank everyone again for coming here tonight. Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Rachel Silberstein for her talk tonight.